Hello everyone, welcome to my new video on my Mathematics Essentials series. In this video, I'm going to talk about how we decide which rule to apply between the sine rule and the cosine rule when we are working or solving problems about non-right angle triangles. Okay, so I've written out the sine rule and the cosine rule, and in a lot of cases, you can apply either rule. Okay, in some cases, you can apply one rule and not the other. Okay. In practice, when you're able to apply both rules, usually the sine rule is quicker to apply, but there is one case in which you should be careful when you apply the sine rule. And that's when your triangle has an obtuse angle and you're given certain bits of information and asked to find something. It's when you're given two sides and an angle that's not between the two sides, and you're asked to find another, the other angle that's not between the two sides. That's known as the ambiguous case. That's the topic of an upcoming video, so I'm not going to focus on it in this video. But for the remainder of this video, let's assume we know how to handle the ambiguous case. All right. And what do I mean by cases? Well, I've written down some examples. Okay, so the cases are just different scenarios where you're given information about the triangle and asked to find something. So, for instance, you may be given three sides and asked to find an angle, or you may be given two sides and the angle between them and asked to find a side. Okay, maybe you're given two angles and a side and you're asked to find a side, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So that's what I mean by cases. And when the cosine rule and the sine rule is taught, when they're taught, typically, you're exposed to a bunch of cases and you are encouraged to remember which cases are better suited to the application of which rule. So, for instance, given three sides and asked to find an angle, you should use the cosine rule. You're encouraged to remember facts like that, and they're pretty easy to forget, and I don't think it's even necessary to remember them. Okay, that's my motivation for making this video, really, is that the equations themselves, the cosine rule and the sine rule, tell you what they're suited to. Okay, so there's some things we know right off the bat if we just look at the equations. Okay, if you look at the cosine rule, only one angle appears in the equation, right? So if you know more than one angle, the cosine rule doesn't really make use of all of the information that you know, right? Whereas all three angles appear in the sine rule. Okay. Now, if you know two angles, you know three. Okay, there's no such thing as just knowing two angles of a triangle. Okay, because the interior angles of any triangle must sum to 180 degrees or pi radians. So once you know two angles, you subtract those angles from pi radians or from 180 degrees, and that gets you the third angle. So there's no such thing as only knowing two angles of a triangle. You either know one or you know all three, right? So the way it really, what it really comes down to is if in the information you're given, you're only given one angle, it's the cosine rule, right? If you are given more than one angle, it's the sine rule, okay? And I'm just going to quickly go through some cases and cross out in red everything we would know in those cases, and it will reveal how that equation would look with respect to the quantity that we're asked to find. So let's look at case one. Given three sides and asked to find an angle. Well, in both of the rules, all three sides appear, right? So in both rules, we could cross out in red anything that just depends on one of the sides. So for instance, in the cosine rule, given that we know all three sides, we know what the squares of those three sides are, and the product of any two of the sides we know. So we could cross that out. And we know what multiplying it by -2 would be. So really, all of this stuff is stuff that we would know. And we would just be left with the angle that we want to find. Okay? So the cosine rule would be easy to apply in that case. Whereas in the sine rule, okay, we know 3 sides, so we could cross all 3 out, but we don't know any of the angles. So no matter which equation we work with, whether we choose this one, or this one, there are always going to be 2 unknowns. Okay, one equation with 2 unknowns. Those unknowns will be angles, or the signs of angles, really. Okay, so the sine rule would not be very helpful. Okay, let's consider case 2. So case 2, all right, given 2 sides and the angle between them, find a side. All right, so in case 2, well, the cosine rule is actually built that way. All right, notice that we're only given one angle, all right, and we're given 2 sides. We're asked to find the angle between them. The cosine rule is built like that. And what do I mean? I mean that if you look at the sides that appear in some way or other on the right-hand side of the cosine rule, okay, so in this case, those sides are B and C in the way that I've written the cosine rule here, okay, the angle that you are taking the cosine of is the angle between those 2 sides. Okay, so A is between B and C. All right, it's opposite the side on the left-hand side of the equation. All right, so it's almost like the cosine rule was born for that case. Okay, so 2 sides and the angle between them, what would we be crossing out in the cosine rule? Well, we would know B and C. So we would know B squared and C squared. We would know what BC is, as well as multiplying it by -2. We were also given the angle between them, which is A. So we know what A is. So we would know what the cosine of A is as well. And all we would be left with on the left-hand side is the square of the angle that we are being asked to find. So we could just take the square root of both sides, and we would have A. Okay, if we contrast this with the sine rule, all right, well, we only know one angle, so sticking to the same knowns and unknowns as when I went through the cosine rule, we would know the angle A, which means we could take the sine of A, all right, and we know the sides. What were we given? 2 sides. Yeah, we know the sides B and C. Okay, now you can see whichever equation we pick, it's not going to be very convenient because we have 2 unknowns. Okay, if we pick this equation, we also have 2 unknowns, A and the sine of C. And here we have 2 unknowns if we pick this equation, the sine of B and the sine of C. Okay, so we would use the cosine rule, right? Let's take a look at the next case. Case 3. All right, we're given 2 angles and a side, and we're asked to find a side. Okay, this case really splits into 2 subcases. But remember, like I said at the start of this video, you don't have to remember cases except the ambiguous case, which is the topic of an upcoming video. Okay, so this splits into 2 subcases. I'll explain what I mean. Given 2 angles and a side, find a side. So let's take a look at the cosine rule. Well, again, the cosine rule only refers to one angle. We're given 2 angles. So that's an indicator that the cosine rule isn't going to help us because it's not going to make use of everything we know. We know more than one angle. The cosine rule only refers to one angle. So 2 angles and asked to find a side. Let's just cross out the sine of 2 angles because if we know A and we know B, then we would know what their sines are. We're given 2 angles and a side. Okay, now if the side is opposite one of the angles we know, so let's say it's A, well, if we're asked to find this side, Well, that's fine. We take this equation. We only have one unknown. And in this case, it would make sense to write the sine rule with the sides in the numerators and the signs of the angle in the denominators. Okay. If instead we were asked to find one of the sides, or the side that's not opposite any of the angles we know, well, remember we know two angles, so we actually do know a third. So we could find the third angle, which means we could find its sine, and we would just take this equation. Okay, and again, we only have one unknown. That would be the side C. Okay, so in this case, or those two subcases of that case, we would apply the sine rule. And now let's take a look at case 4. Okay, in case 4, we're given two sides and an angle that's not between them, and we're asked to find an angle not between them. Okay, so this is actually the ambiguous case. All right, so let's cross out what we would know. We are given two sides and an angle not between them, which means the angle is opposite one of the sides we know. So let's say the sides we know are A and B. Okay, we're given an angle that's not between them. Well, the angle between A and B would be the angle C. So it means we either know the angle A or the angle B. Let's just say it's the angle A. So then we would know the sine of A. All right. And what are we asked to find? We're asked to find an angle not between them. Okay, which means an angle opposite them, opposite one of the sides we know. Okay, so in this case, we would be asked to find the angle B, and you can see that there's only one unknown. That is the angle B. So we would just take this equation, multiply both sides by B. We'd have the sine of B on one side, take the arcsine of both sides. That would isolate B, right, and give us an answer for B. Right, and this is actually the ambiguous case. So if you were to punch the arcsine into a scientific calculator, it's not that your scientific calculator is making mistakes or anything like that, but even though you punch in the right information to the calculator, it might give you an answer that you're not looking for. And this is to do with the fact that the sine of theta is also equal to the sine of pi minus theta. Okay, so more on that in an upcoming video. All right, so this would be the ambiguous case. You would choose the sine rule. It's easier, but you would also be careful not to make a mistake and handle the ambiguous case properly. All right, so on everything we've done, let's just summarize that this all boils down to really just some brief statements. Assuming you know how to handle the ambiguous case, then this is how you pick the rule. Okay, if you know more than one angle, you just use the sine rule. Okay, because remember, knowing more than one angle is the same as knowing all three. All right, otherwise, you use the cosine rule. So if you only have one angle, use the cosine rule. If you have more than one angle, use the sine rule. And you don't really have to remember that anyways, because that statement is kind of embodied in the rules. You can see that the cosine rule only refers to one angle. In the way that I've written it, it just makes reference to the angle A. All right, whereas the sine rule refers to all three angles in the triangle. Okay, so it's very easy to pick which rule to use. You don't have to remember a bunch of cases, despite how it might seem when you first encounter the cosine rule and the sine rule. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful. I hope you liked it. If you did find this video helpful, feel free to give it a like or share it. If you have any questions, just post them in the comments. And if you want a notification when I upload a new video, just subscribe to my channel. Until next time, bye for now.